The information provided in the interviews and on the website of the Autism, ADHD, and Sensory Processing Disorder Summit is for information and educational purposes only. It is not intended to diagnose or treat your child and is not a substitute for working with a qualified practitioner. There are many gifted, passionate, and knowledgeable practitioners with hundreds of hours, if not thousands of hours of clinical experience. Part of our goal is to give you the knowledge and tools you need to effectively advocate for your child. No one knows your child better than you. No one knows your child's history and can better judge what's normal and abnormal for your child. The greatest success in recovery comes with the parent being informed and asking the right questions and making the best decisions for their child in coordination with a team of qualified practitioners in different areas of specialty. Enjoy the summit. Hi, everyone. I want to welcome to the Autism, ADHD, and Sensory Processing Disorder Summit, Dr. Lila Mason. I am really excited about the talk we're going to have today because it's all about the ADHD pretenders. And the things like nutrient deficiencies and toxins that can be mistaken for ADHD. So it's a great starting point from any parent that thinks that they may have a child with ADHD. But before we get started, I just want to tell you a little bit about Dr. Mason. She is a consultant pediatrician who specializes in nutritional and environmental health for children's health problems, including allergies, asthma, behavior problems, autism spectrum disorders, and ADHD. She received her medical doctorate from the Free University of Berlin and did her pediatric specialist training at the University of California in San Francisco. She received her master's in public health from Harvard University and her diploma in tropical medicine from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Lila has worked in the US, Europe, New Zealand, and volunteered for 2 years setting up a clinic in Pakistan before moving to Sydney this year or in the past. She is a fellow of the Royal Australian College of Physicians and the Australian College of Nutritional and Environmental Medicine. Dr. Mason has an integrative pediatric practice in Sydney, lectures internationally, and is the author of the Children's Health A to Z Guide to Natural Therapies for Common Childhood Illnesses. I want to welcome you today. Obviously you have lots of depth and breadth of experience, and right now you're in Berlin lecturing as well. So I appreciate you taking the time to talk to us today.
Hi, Tara. It's a great pleasure and an honor to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. Before we get started, obviously you've done a lot of different things, and starting out in traditional medicine, being trained as a pediatrician. Can you tell us why you continued your education and have now become an integrative pediatrician?
Yeah, so I studied medicine in Germany, and Germany has a really long tradition of integrating herbal medicine and some natural therapies into mainstream medicine. So they, even as a medical student, I was already exposed to those kind of things. And then once I'd finished my residency, I had some patients and friends with children who had autism, ADHD, problems like that, and they really didn't know, they didn't want to go the medicine route. And for autism, obviously, there isn't really a medical therapy. And they asked me to look into it, and they actually begged me to go to some conferences to find out about biomedical treatments. And I went, and I was quite skeptical at the beginning, but I was convinced very quickly that some of these therapies are very, very useful and really make a huge difference for families and their children. And now, of course, many years later, I've seen hundreds of children do so well, even to the point where they lost their diagnoses. And so that was my path.
Well, it's interesting that you say that, because a lot of the speakers on the summit and the practitioners that I've met throughout the years have a story similar to that, where they have either themselves or their friends and family have wanted them to dig in. And once they do, they really do find that there is a different way of going about doing things that can be very effective. So today, though, we're going to talk about the rapid increase in the ADHD diagnosis. And you have a perspective on this, which I think is really important for parents to hear, about making sure that that diagnosis is accurate, or whether or not we can resolve some of the symptoms through some easier lifestyle interventions. So why don't we dive right into that? And maybe give us a little overview of what you want to talk about today.
Yeah, I mean, as you know, a diagnosis of ADHD is just based on symptoms and behavior. So there's no blood test you can take and say this child for sure has ADHD, just as you would with an infection or diabetes. So it's very, very subjective. And we see a huge increase in ADHD. Every year there are more children being diagnosed. And I think part of it is that our lifestyle has changed so much that it really isn't in sync anymore with how we evolved to live. And that has, for example, we don't eat the food we were evolved to live. You know, when you look at kids, a lot of kids eat just different versions of a mix of white flour, sugar, some dairy, some fat mixed together. You know, they have, I don't know, a breakfast cereal that's sugary and wheaty, and then they have with milk, and then they have a sandwich with cheese for lunch, and then they have pasta with cheese later. And they don't eat the things we need to eat to get nutrients. I mean, those foods will give you calories. You won't be skinny, but you will not be healthy, and you won't have, for example, iron or magnesium or zinc or other minerals you need to be healthy, and vitamins as well. And so that food is a huge thing. And then, of course, we add a lot of additives to make it attractive to the children. So colors and then preservatives, so it lasts forever, that are not put in there for our best interest or our children's best interest, because they don't make the food more nutritious. They just make it more stable on the shelf and maybe more attractive because it's a bright color and so kids want to buy it. So food is a huge thing, a diet, and I think that's really the number one thing to look at, because I have seen so many children who just were eating the standard American or SAD diet and got improved in terms of their behavior and focus and concentration and learning so much just by changing the diet, taking out the additives and actually putting some real food in there, lots of vegetables, of course. So, and there are some specific preservatives and colorings that have been tested and been shown to make children hyperactive and interfere with their learning. So like the 102 and 202. And so we have lots of research on that. This is not something that's new. We have known this for a while. Then the other thing is that we also are exposed to many, many more toxins than you and I were exposed to when we were children, you know, and our children's brains are developing right now. And when you expose them to one of those 80,000 toxins that are being produced, chemicals, and most of those have not been tested to see if they're safe, you know, for the brain, for our bodies. So we're really playing a game of Russian roulette there with our children's brains. So that's another big one. And then I think also our general lifestyle, we don't sleep enough anymore. We don't spend enough time outdoors in green environments. And we spend far too much time in front of screens. And all of those have been shown to be associated with having an increased risk of getting a diagnosis of ADHD.
Mm-hmm. So why don't we dive in first, because you said food is really the biggest obstacle in some cases in terms of the kids getting the nutrients they need. What are some of the nutrient deficiencies that you're seeing in your patients' population where they have symptoms of ADHD?
Yeah. So the number one, most common one is actually iron deficiency. And we know that children who are iron deficient, they struggle with focus, concentration, with sitting still, hyperactive behavior, they can't sleep very well. So all the things that give you a diagnosis of ADHD. And it's very, very easy to test. You do a quick blood test and you can see if your child has enough iron and also enough iron stores. You need both. And it's the most common deficiency in children and needs to be checked in every child who has those kind of issues that would give them a diagnosis of ADHD. And, you know, there are many reasons why so many kids are iron deficient these days. One is that they may not be eating enough iron, but the other one is that they may not be absorbing it. And one of the causes is that children are put often on reflux medication already as babies. Mm-hmm. And this reflux medication makes the stomach acid less acid, and you need the acidity in the stomach in order to absorb your iron, and B12 actually. So some of those babies already anemic in their first year of life on those medications and never really quite catch up. So it's very, very important to check that. And then also, if children have a cow's milk protein intolerance, they often have microscopic bleeding. You can't see it, but it's in the gut. If you test the blood, for the feces, the stool, for hidden blood, you will find that. And that just the microscopic, tiny, tiny droplets of blood is enough blood loss to make you anemic or make the child anemic. And then, of course, there are children who have celiac disease. That's another disease that's on the rise. It's now more than 1% of children. So it is quite common. So, and they are often very, very iron deficient. So it's really important to check that. And then, of course, children who are growing very rapidly, which most kids are doing, they need more iron in those growth spurts. So it's very, very important to make sure that they get a diet high in iron. And I myself am vegan, so I'm not pushing the meat, but meat is a good source of iron. But green leafy vegetables are as well, and you just have to eat more of it. You have to eat more because it's not as easily absorbed as the iron from meat, but you can still meet your requirements. So it's very important to check iron.
Now, so what are the blood tests that parents should make sure that they're having done, and are there functional ranges versus lab ranges that you look for?
Yeah, so I think the most important one that's usually low is ferritin. Ferritin is a marker of your iron stores. So the iron itself, you just want to be in the normal range. You don't want to have iron too high either. It's not a good idea to have too much iron in your blood. But ferritin, we used to say it just has to be above 20 to be fine, but now we know that for optimal brain development and myelination, which means, this wrapping of myelin around the nerve sheath in the brain, which is so important in our brain development, you need ferritin above 40 or even 50. So I like my patients to have at least 40. And I have to tell you, of all the children who come with those issues, not a single one is ever above 40. They're all much, much lower, usually in the teens.
So are there, obviously eating red meats for hem iron or the green leafies, is there any other way that parents can ensure their kids are, and then also addressing the digestive issues, but is there any other way to help them absorb the iron better?
Yeah, so if you eat iron with vitamin C, you absorb it much better. So that's a big one. So if you eat green leafy vegetables, for example, add some tomatoes. So that has vitamin C and will help you increase the absorption. If you take, if you eat a cereal that's iron enriched, if you have some orange juice or some water with lemon with it, that's vitamin C. It will also help you absorb more of that iron. Another little trick is to cook in cast iron pots or skillets. You do get a little bit of iron every time you cook in those. So that's an easy thing to do. And you can, of course, take supplements. There are lots and lots of good tasting herbal supplements. There are capsules. It depends how old the child is and how low the iron is. If you just want to prevent it, you don't want to give a big dose if you don't know whether the child is actually iron deficient or not.
Yeah.
So, but those would be my recommendations. And then, of course, not taking antacids.
So what are some of the other nutrient deficiencies that you also see?
Okay, so the other really big ones are magnesium. So if you're low in magnesium, you actually become hyperactive and irritable and easily upset. And you can also get anxiety, sleep problems. If you don't sleep well, you're not going to learn well and concentrate well. You can get muscle cramps and tics, like these little, when your muscles tick a little bit. So it's a cofactor that for enzymes that are needed to produce dopamine and serotonin. So those are the neurotransmitters that make us calm and happy and able to concentrate. Magnesium is not that easy and not that difficult to get from your diet, but unfortunately people don't eat those foods. You need to eat at least 5 servings of vegetables a day and a handful of nuts. If you do that, you will get enough magnesium. Ideally at least 200 to 400 milligrams. So adults need 400 milligrams of magnesium a day, and very few get it. So about 60% of Americans and I imagine Canadians, and I know Australians and New Zealanders are magnesium deficient. and have some of those symptoms, nightmares, sleep problems, muscle cramps. And I get a lot of parents who come and say, my child has growing pains, their calves get really sore. And growing does not really hurt, it is muscle cramps from being super active. And the more active you are, the more magnesium you need. So if you think of a marathon runner, he needs, or she needs to take an extra dose of magnesium to relax those muscles. And our children often run around so much, they're like little marathon runners and they need more magnesium. So the thing with magnesium is you cannot really overdose on foods that are high in magnesium. If you take a magnesium supplement by mouth, you could theoretically overdose, but you actually get diarrhea. And then your body just stops absorbing it and just lets it out. And there is a nice little trick for magnesium as well. You can take an Epsom salt bath. Epsom salts are magnesium sulfate and they absorb through the skin. So very easy. You can put your child in the bathtub in the evening or even a foot bath and just put a cup of Epsom salts in there. Make sure it's food grade, so it's not contaminated. Don't use the one for the garden. And the children will be calmer and they'll sleep better. And if your child has slept well, they'll be happier the next morning.
Yeah, without a doubt. The other one I really like to use is a magnesium oil on the bottoms of the feet only, because otherwise it makes the skin itchy, but up through the bottoms of the feet, it seems to help quite a bit.
Absolutely. I love that too. Magnesium lotion, magnesium oil, all kinds. And I actually think that the itchiness is often a sign that you're really low in magnesium. Once you have a better magnesium store in your body, it often stops itching.
Yeah, it is a really good indicator. Is there the other thing, from what my understanding of magnesium in terms of the things that use it up to is a high sugar diet will also, or high carbohydrate diet will use up your magnesium stores faster. Do you think that's why we're seeing so many kids that are magnesium deficient right now?
Yeah, I mean, sugar is really our, number one diet enemy. We need to get our kids off sugar. One of my colleagues in New Zealand always says, we're the only species that rewards our children for good behavior with something that actually is bad for them. We give them sweets and we know they're not good for them, so we really just have to stop that. And everybody has a sweet tooth, and we evolved to have that because sweets were so rare. You would once in a while find some fruit that was ripe, and then you, of course, enjoyed eating that. That's great. But nowadays we have sweets everywhere. And sugar is very bad for our brains, very bad for our immune system, and really bad for our gut as well. You really change your gut flora if you eat a lot of sugar. And that, again, can affect behavior. If you have the wrong kind of gut bacteria, it can make you hyperactive. We're talking a lot now about the brain-gut axis, and there's a huge amount of research going into that now. And it is clear that whatever you put in your mouth and gets into your gut can cause inflammation and can, get bad or not so good gut bacteria to overgrow. And they produce chemicals, and those chemicals affect our behavior. Yeah. So it's, I think everybody should see the Sugar movie and get rid of sugar in their diet. That's the best thing they can do if they just want to start out.
Yeah, it makes such a massive difference to overall health. There's no doubt about it. So we've talked about iron and magnesium. What other deficiencies do you note in your patients?
So another really big one is omega-3 fatty acids. Those are the essential fatty acids we can't really produce ourselves, EPA and DHA. And I have to say that a lot of pediatricians, not just integrative pediatricians, do recommend omega-3 fatty acids for children who have problems with focus and concentration and hyperactivity. If you check your child's upper arm, if the skin on the upper arm is quite rough, like sandpaper, that may be an indication that your child is low in omega-3. And of course, I'm not really that worried about the skin on the arms, but it's an indication that omega-3 is lacking in the whole entire body, including the brain. And that's where we need it the most. Omega-3s make up the membranes of each brain cell. So the membranes are made up of these soft, nice liquid oils. And if you have enough omega-3, because they are so soft, information can really travel very easily from one cell to another. But if you don't have enough omega-3 in your diet, and most people don't, or they have just too much omega-6, omega-6 are found in kind of fried foods and baked foods that are baked in, commercially. They don't use the most expensive oils, they use the cheapest, like margarine. And so if you get too much omega-6 and too little omega-3, that ratio really affects how brittle the membranes in your cells become in the brain. And if they're tougher, information just doesn't travel through so easily. So that's really important. And there have been many, many studies to show that if you give children a big dose of omega-3 for a few months, that their focus improves, their concentration improves, their behavior. So I usually recommend a mixture of both EPA and DHA. They have different roles, but they work together. Mm-hmm. EPA is more anti-inflammatory, so it reduces inflammation, which is very important because inflammation is not a buzzword in medical research, because every disease or illness or unwellness really has to do with inflammation, whether it's your joints that are hurting you or a headache, or depression or anxiety, it all has to do with inflammation. So EPA reduces inflammation, kind of puts out the fire, very important. And DHA is really important for the brain cells. It helps with myelination again, putting those little myelin sheaths around the neurons, the nerve cells in the brain, which make all the information travel through much, much faster. And it's just neuroprotective. It's good for your brain. Mm-hmm. So depending on how old the child is, you should check with your health professional, but often, in schooling, 1,000 milligrams of combined EPA and DHA are recommended. And it's a pretty big dose. But in the beginning, if your child is low, you really need to give a big dose to see the changes quickly. If you give a tiny dose, it will take forever. Mm-hmm. And the problems with omega-3 that you have to look out for, if you give too much, you thin your blood. That's actually one of the advantages of omega-3 fatty acids. They thin your blood a little bit, make it less sticky, so you have better blood flow everywhere, but including the brain. But if you make it too thin, you could have bleeds, or bruising, nosebleeds, those kind of things. So if you see that, then obviously you have to stop it and start back after the bleeding stops on a much lower dose. But apart from that, omega-3s are really very safe. You need to also get a good brand, because where do omega-3s come from? They come mostly from fish, and fish is highly contaminated with lots and lots of toxins, mercury, PCBs, plasticizers, all kinds of things, which you really don't want to put into your child. So you need to get a brand that molecularly distills the fish oil and takes out all the bad stuff, and you're only left with the good things. I go actually a step further, and I get it from where the fish get their omega-3 from. They get it from eating algae. Mm-hmm. So an algae oil is just as good to get EPA and DHA, and it's very, very clean because it gets produced organically outside the ocean. So it doesn't get contaminated. And you actually do some good for climate change by taking CO2 out of the atmosphere in the production of algae oil. So that's been my recommendation.
Yeah, that's a great idea. And there are a number of products now. It's becoming more readily available to find the omega-3 products from algae. So the next deficiency I think you wanted to talk about was zinc. What are you seeing, and how does a zinc deficiency present in a child that looks like they have ADHD?
Yeah, so zinc deficiency is probably the most common one I see overall in all children, because in Australia and in New Zealand, we live in countries where the soils have very little zinc. And I know in many parts of America and Canada, that's also the case. So we should be able to get enough zinc from what we eat, if we eat whole grains and healthy foods. But if the foods are grown on soils that are already deficient in zinc, then you're not going to get it. Mm-hmm. So what I see in children, first of all, when I examine them, is I see white spots on their fingernails. Lots of little white spots. Sometimes they even, if they're very zinc deficient, they have stretch marks. So I have seen teenagers with really severe stretch marks from zinc deficiency, acne. So when you think acne, think zinc. And slow healing wounds. So those are the children who get a mosquito bite on their leg and it just does not heal. It takes weeks and weeks, and just gets a little bit infected. Maybe even the lower you zinc, the more skin infections you get and the slower the wounds will heal. In terms of the children's health, typically they get a lot of infections. They have a lot of ear infections or throat, skin, and they are irritable. If your zinc is low, you have a low frustration tolerance. So even little things will annoy you and you get upset really easily, which of course is typical for kids with ADHD. They also are maybe picky eaters because if you don't have enough zinc, your taste buds don't work very well. So you don't eat, you just eat white food, for example. So the zinc is really, really important for that. And I've seen many children who are zinc deficient and the parents said, my kid won't eat anything. I can give him all the healthy foods that you tell me to give him or her, but they won't eat it. And just after, a month or two of zinc, they will start eating those foods. So it really broadens their appetite. The other things for zinc to look out for that are maybe signs of low zinc are the typical learning problems of kids with ADHD. So they have slow processing speed. They may be super smart and have a very high IQ, but they just process things slowly in their brain. And that can improve dramatically with zinc. And poor memory. So kids who just, they learn something and then they forget it the next day and they have to learn it again and forget it again. But I would say that overall, the most typical symptom of a child who's low in zinc is that low frustration tolerance, that irritable child who's just not very happy and gets upset by tiny things.
Yeah, it's really interesting that symptom alone. I'm sure a lot of parents can relate to that. So, and it's such a simple solution.
Mm-hmm.
What types of, in what types of forms do you typically recommend to patients to take zinc in?
So zinc, it depends on whether the child can swallow a capsule or won't. So you can get transdermal zinc. You can get zinc creams made up that you put on the skin that gets absorbed, and it works nicely. If you take it by mouth, it's best to be taken in the evening. And I like zinc percolinate or zinc citrate. And, some children do better with one, better with the other, but most actually I find do fine with both. If they're zinc deficient, they just need to get some good quality zinc. You have to be, careful with kids with ADHD that you get good brands, because if they are contaminated with, or they have other additives in the capsules, that alone could make them more irritable. So, really want to go for a brand that has tested the zinc to make it sure it's pure and hasn't added a lot of other things to the capsule.
Yeah, it's a really great point, and it's something actually that a colleague of yours, Vicki Kohlbrenner, is going to be talking about all about on the summit is different supplements and how to get good quality supplements and making sure that it has the right ingredients in it or lack thereof of ingredients to ensure that they are working well. So it's a really good point to bring up. What about vitamin D? Is it something that you see impacting these kids as well?
Absolutely. Vitamin D is so important for our mood and immune system, of course, and also our bones. I mean, that we've known for a long time that you need vitamin D to get strong bones. And unfortunately, with our modern lifestyle, we don't get enough vitamin D. So we were evolved near the equator and we lived outdoors all the time and didn't wear a lot of clothes. So we got a lot of sunshine and made vitamin D. So you make vitamin D when the sun hits your skin, you produce vitamin D. And nowadays children, live far away from the equator. I mean, you're in Canada, very far. But even Sydney in Australia, it's very sunny, but in the winter, the sun is at an angle where it just won't produce vitamin D in the skin, or not enough. And then children, of course, in Australia and New Zealand, we have to be very careful that children don't get sunburned. That is very important, because if they get sunburned, they have an increased risk of skin cancer. So we need to avoid that. But sometimes we may be too careful. You know, I see kids who are really, really pale in the summer. I think, what's happening? And I said, well, we are very careful. We never let our child out. And I said, well, you can buy a UV meter or get an app on your phone where you can see when the UV radiation is safe. And that maybe sometimes before 8 or 9 a.m. and after 5 in the, at the height of summer. But there's always some time during the day when you actually are safe to go out, at least with your arms and your, upper body maybe, or your legs. But we do need vitamin D to have a good mood and to reduce inflammation once again. If you have low vitamin D, you're more likely to have autoimmune diseases and inflammatory diseases. And we know that children with ADHD are more likely to be vitamin D deficient. So very, very important. Now you can take vitamin D supplements. And as a matter of fact, many countries that are far away from the equator, like Northern Europe, have a public health policy where they give children vitamin D daily in the winter at least. And all my colleagues in Europe take vitamin D. They all have read the research, and I say, wow, of course we do. So we want to be happy. We don't want to get depressed in the winter. And I think if you have a child who's already struggling to concentrate and, focusing and gets into trouble at school, anything you can do to improve their mood is a good thing.
Yeah. And generally speaking, what other nutrients would you also tell parents to make sure that their kids are getting in order to support them?
Yeah, so there are some nutrients that are that have been shown to help the brain in kids with ADHD. So for example, phosphatidylcholine and phosphatidylserine, they are phospholipids that are just like the omega-3 fatty acids we talked about before, are really important for the integrity of cell membranes. And they, those nutrients also are involved in cleaning up the brain. So when you have dead brain cells that need to just go, they do that. They destroy those dead cells. And that's very, very important. The cleaning up of our brain is super, super important. And that's why sleep is so important. At night, there's actually very important work happening in the brain, the cleanup. So phosphatidylcholine and serine, you can find that in foods. If you eat enough cauliflower and broccoli and foods like that, you will get it, but a lot of kids don't get enough. So you can get it as a supplement once again, but I always prefer that children get their nutrients to food as much as possible. Mm-hmm. And if they eat the colors of the rainbow every day and get their minimum of 5 servings of vegetables, which each serving is the size of their fist, and ideally 5 different colors, they will probably get, their phosphatidylcholine and serine. But if you're not sure, then, it may be something that's very safe to supplement. You want to make sure your child has enough iodine. Yeah, so especially if you live in an area that is iodine deficient, so the soils are low in iodine. Iodine deficiency is the #1 cause of intellectual disability in the world, and it's preventable. Yeah, so but a lot of mothers during pregnancy are low on iodine. Many countries now give iodine supplements in pregnancy because they know it's so important for the baby's brain development. But of course, it's also important for our older children's brain development. So that's really important. For iodine, I love as a food seaweed. Either the little snacks or the big nori sheets, and I put a little bit of oil on it and put it through a gas flame and make it kind of crunchy, and then cut it into little pieces, little sea salt on top of it, and my kids love that. Mm-hmm. So that will give you iodine and a lot of other nutrients, So that would be another one. I think in general, antioxidants are fantastic for the brain. Again, if you eat plenty of antioxidants, you get your 5 servings of vegetables and your 2 of fruit, and you don't eat a lot of pro-oxidant food, that deep fried white food, you will get enough antioxidants. But if you're exposed to lots of toxins, or if you're not eating a very healthy diet, then it may be helpful to just get more antioxidant into the child. particularly for ADHD, I have two antioxidants I love because they really help the brain function better. One is green tea extract, the L-theanine. It actually changes the brain waves to a calmer pattern and also helps children sleep at night, but during the day it helps them with focus and concentration. And the other one is pine bark extract, pycnogenol. There are quite a few studies to show that it works very, very well for focus and concentration. There was one study that showed it worked as well as Ritalin. And it's safe, very, very safe, and just helps these kids really just to concentrate and with memory as well. So.
Well, that's actually a great list of additional things that people can try when they've already taken care of the first things in terms of the nutrient deficiencies. So thank you very much for those as well. You also mentioned at the very beginning of the talk that there's some neurotoxins and toxins that we should be looking to avoid. Can you briefly go over some of those ones as well so that parents can make sure that their exposure has been minimized, if not eliminated?
Yeah, I'd love to. I'd love to talk about toxins because we can avoid a lot of them. You know, I mean, when I say we have 80,000 chemicals that are produced and most of them haven't been tested on children's brains, some people can kind of say, well, let's just give up. You know, it's just too much work. There's nothing you can do, but there's actually quite a few things you can do. I mean, the number one chemical or toxin associated with ADHD is lead. Yeah, we know that if a child is exposed to lead as a young child, they're much higher risk of having ADHD. And lead was in old paint. So houses that have been painted before the mid-1970s may still have lead on the outdoor paint. And if it is flaking, it just leaves a very fine dust on the ground. And young kids, you know, they crawl on the floor, they get the dust on their fingers and they put it in their mouth and they ingest lead. Of course, you know, in America, we've heard about lead in the water. Terrible. Lead can also be in painted toys. You know, if you buy cheap toys from China, they may be lead contaminated. So what I do always do a lead test on children, and I think most doctors in North America will check kids' lead levels. Everybody's. It's not just for the children who have any kind of learning problems, because it's so common. And the interesting thing about lead is that we used to have, you know, the range of normal for lead gets set, and every few years it gets lowered by half, because we know actually that the only safe level of lead is 0. Even the smallest amount of lead affects your IQ, affects your learning, affects your behavior. So we really want 0. And if the child has any lead, you have to find out where it's coming from. I always recommend to get a little lead testing kit from the hardware store and just check toys and crockery and maybe glazed pots or pans that, you know, handmade especially, often have a little bit of lead in the glaze and the paint. So it's very, very important to find where it's coming from and eliminate that exposure. Another common toxin is mercury, and that usually comes from fish. So if a child eats a lot of fish, or, you know, maybe not a lot, but large fish, the larger the fish, the higher the mercury level, because it accumulates in them, and the larger fish live longer, so they have more time to accumulate the mercury from the food they're eating, from the smaller fish. And mercury can make you very hyperactive. You know, think of the Mad Hatter in Alice in Wonderland. He was mercury toxic because the felt hat makers used to use mercury to make that felt. So he's a typical example. There are lots of other ones. Pesticides are a terrible one, and I think pesticides can be avoided. You know, I mean, a lot of people still use fly sprays in their home. That's a pesticide. And it gets not only absorbed by the pests, but also by your children, you know, and accumulates in the brain and affects brain function. Also pesticides in the garden, you know, you don't just let your plants grow, and if you need to weed, do it by hand, you know, don't just kill everything off. If you can get organic food, that would be ideal. And we have studies that show that the more pesticide exposure a woman in her pregnancy has, the higher the risk that that child develops ADHD. Yeah. And we also have studies where they check the urine of children, teenagers and young children, and correlated how much pesticide they had in their urine and whether they were ADHD type children or they had the diagnosis. And if you had, so the children with ADHD had the highest levels of pesticide in their urine. Now you don't know what came first, but it's definitely a good idea to get rid of pesticides in your home. And it's not impossible. That's one of the ones that's really quite easy to do. I actually have a checklist on my website that you can download and just go through your household and just check off, making your house less toxic. I think it's a very, very good thing. And some people get overwhelmed. I say, just start with one. The first one is to take off your shoes when you come into your home, because on your shoes, you will carry in toxins from outside, including pesticides. And then if you walk around the floor and your children play on the floor, they will get those on their hands and into their system. So that's another one. There are many, but I think if you just start with those, you have a good beginning.
Yeah, I think that's great. And we'll make sure that we link to that checklist so people, it's easy to get to right below this talk. So just make sure you go there at the end of the interview. So we've gone through a lot of nutrient deficiencies. Obviously, there's toxins that are involved as well in some of these symptoms, which if people start to do that, like you said, start with where you can and then keep working through it. What about any other lifestyle interventions that you would recommend as you're sort of going through the checklist of all the things you can do before even considering other types of interventions?
Yeah, I mean, lifestyle is kind of my favorite topic because I think we all need to live a healthier lifestyle. And if you teach your children a healthy lifestyle young, they'll keep that on for, until they're adults, and they're less likely to get a heart attack at 55 because they're so stressed. So the three main things in the lifestyle really are that your child needs enough sleep. And most children don't get enough sleep nowadays. We have really an epidemic of sleep deprivation. And sleep deprivation is a great torture method. They use it as a torture for people because they know they go crazy. They can't concentrate. They become irritable. It's very, very difficult. And most children do not sleep enough. Okay, and people will ask, how much sleep do you need? I mean, I have a list on the checklist. You can read up how much approximately your child needs for their age. But it really is, they need enough sleep to wake up happy in the morning, jump out of bed and be ready to start the day. And most children need to be dragged out of bed, So that's really important, the sleep. And, there are studies where they took children and gave them an IQ test. And then a week later, they just woke them up an hour before their normal wake up time. So they had 1 hour less sleep than usual. And did another IQ test, and the IQ dropped. These kids, of course, didn't become, less intelligent in a week. It's that sleep is so incredibly important for your brain to work well. Now, the other lifestyle is to play outdoors. Okay, there are many studies now on ecotherapy, it's called, or green play. And some people even go so far as to say that ADHD is not attention deficit hyperactivity syndrome, but it's nature deficit syndrome. So we know that if children play in green areas outdoors, even for half an hour, for an hour, they concentrate better, they're calmer, they're happier, they're more creative in their problem solving. So it is so important to get that at least an hour a day of outdoor play in green areas, green environments. So it's not enough to go into a concrete basketball court. You really have to be somewhere where you are a bit in nature. Now, luckily, most places in the world, you'll have a park or playground somewhere within walking distance. I have to say, in Australia, we're so lucky, we're always near a beach or a park. But even in inner cities, right now I'm in Berlin, in Germany, and every other corner there's a playground and a little park, because people live in apartments here. So they don't have a backyard to play in, but they do make sure those parks are always filled with children, you know, so that's really nice to see. So we talked about enough sleep, outdoor play, at least an hour a day.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other thing is limiting screen time.
Mm-hmm.
Super important. We know that the more time children spend on screens before they're 3 years old, the higher the risk that they will develop ADHD. And that is because if you look at a screen, things move at a very different pace. Mm-hmm. And your brain actually in those first few years develops and adapts to its environment. And if it is used to, you know, things changing quickly on the screens, it will be adapted to that and not to sitting in a classroom and a teacher slowly explaining something, you know, so they get bored very easily and can't concentrate on that. The recommendations for screen time change also every few years. The American Academy of Pediatrics used to say no screens under 3. And now they've changed that. They said no screens under 2, which, you know, I still think it's better not to have screens, but I think it's probably almost impossible in our society to not expose children to screens. So under 2, they say only use a screen for video chatting with people they know well, like if they talk to, you know, a family member, which is, you could say it's not really, you know, playing on a screen, it's communicating with somebody, so that is probably not that bad. But of course, it's always better to communicate with a person, you know, face to face. I think and then, you know, they want a limit of less than 60 minutes for under 5-year-olds, and to make it only educational, really high quality programs. Ideally, an adult should sit there with the child, but how often does that happen? You know, I mean, I see so many children that just have a screen in front of their face because, you know, the parents need a break. But, you know, we used to give children a pad of paper and some crayons when we needed a break, or, you know, or give them a pot to bang, or somebody told me the other day, they said, well, I mean, it's unrealistic. You can't, I mean, how would you look after a child without a screen? And I said, well, you know, we used to do that. It's really only the last 10 years that we have this option of giving a child a screen to keep them quiet during a dinner party or something like that. And, you know, so it is definitely possible, but I think people are getting so used to having the screens everywhere, and the parents do too. And I always say, you have to set a good example. You know, if you're constantly on your phone or checking your computer or, you know, your watch with the screen on it, your children will do that too. They do what you do. They don't do what you tell them to do. So it's very important to make media-free times in the household, and in the evening to take all the phones and all the screens and put them in one area where they get charged, and not in the bedrooms. Really important. Because otherwise the temptation is just too big, you know, to pull out that phone or that screen and start playing, or, you know, and unfortunately the games are also getting worse. You know, as teenagers, the violent games are definitely very bad for their brains.
Yeah. No, I mean, it is such it's a really tough one for parents, because we are getting so used to having them around. I think that you said that, and that almost to the point where we forget that you know, we weren't raised with them, so it can be done many generations before our children. So it's a tough one for sure. Yeah. Well, you've given a ton of information here today. If parents want to find out more about you, what you do, and how you work with your patients, where can they find you?
So I have a website, www.drlilamason.com. And it gives you some information on what I do. I have my practice in Sydney. I also have a Facebook page, Dr. Lila Mason, where I post up-to-date research and blogs. The blogs are also on the Facebook page, on the website, but easiest to see them on the Facebook page, I think. I have a newsletter you can subscribe to through my website, and then you always get the blog first when it's out. And I have written a book, A to Z of Children's Health, which is really a guide for parents. It has 4 chapters at the beginning on the things we talked about today, actually: nutrition, lifestyle, toxins, those kind of things, which are the basis of good health. You know, if you want to raise a healthy child that has healthy habits for lifetime, that's what you need to do. And then it goes from A to Z through common childhood problems like, let's say, headaches or earaches or fever or acne, you know, allergies, all kinds of things, and what you can do in the most natural and most effective way to help your child overcome those.
Yeah, that's fantastic because as you said, all of these things lead to overall health and wellness. So they're things we want to do whether we think our children have ADHD or not, and it can help the whole family. So I'll make sure to link to the book below as well so that people can get it really easily in this day and age of digital books, as they can get it digitally or in hard copy. So I have to thank you so much for all your time today. This has been incredibly informative, and I think that parents will be able to take away a whole bunch of things that they can go back now and look at their child and see where these underlying factors might be contributing to their symptoms. And I expect that there'll be a number of people that can resolve many of them pretty quickly.
Thank you, Tara. It was a real pleasure talking to you.